What's up, guys? This is Nick from Art Study Poker, and in today's video, I'll be continuing the poker hand review series with today's video covering one no limit hand and then one PLO hand, as this series will pretty much do for the rest of the time because I want to cater to both the no limit and the PLO players. So to make sure I cover those games each week, we're going to do one and one and go from there. This week's hands aren't super interesting, but I think they're interesting in a sense that they're going to help you guys in a more generalized way and to show a lot of you guys that are struggling with how to be a little more aggressive, like in position and attacking bets and understanding, how both of your ranges are constructed in certain spots. So let's just get into it, and without me talking and wasting everybody's time here. So today, waiting for a bigger game to get off, I'm in a live 1-2 game, and a player limps, and BFI stands for bets for information. This player, I heard him say many times before I even got involved in this pot with him that he wanted to see where he's at. He wants to bet to find out. He doesn't want to check and have to face a big bet. So whenever I personally hear a player say that they like to bet for information, I like to raise them relentlessly because I don't think they balance this play enough. I think it's usually weaker combos as a part of a weaker and wider range, especially when they limp call in these spots. So he does go ahead and limp, and I make it 10 on the button with King 9 of diamonds. I think that's a fine combo to go ahead and try to ISO with on the button. Big blind calls. This player is not good to put me in a lot of tough spots. Pretty straightforward player. And we see a flop of Queen 7-6 rainbow. So obviously I don't really flop anything other than some backdoors. However, these players are pretty much not going to ever play tough enough in this spot, and they're going to be easily blown off of hands if they make bets that, if they have bet sizings that are very telling, then I think I can get pretty aggressive, and this is a decent combo to do it with, and I'll get into why in a second. First player checks, and the player who likes to bet for information to find out where he's at, he goes ahead and leads for about third pot. He bets $10. I think his range is constructed of weaker Queen X hands, like maybe Queen 10, Queen 9, possibly Queen 8. He could possibly have King, Queen, or Queen Jack, but those are going to be a little more rare, as I think he would raise those suited Broadway combos. So I think he has more weaker queens. I think he could definitely have some combos of possibly pocket 8s, maybe pocket 9s, stuff like 7x, 6x. You see this line a lot if you guys play in these games. This is a spot where I see players folding too much. I think that they call without understanding why they're calling, or really calling without a plan. Like, they're not really floating. They're more just calling because they think it's a weak bet. They want to see some kind of turn card, whether that is specifically a king, I guess, or a 9 maybe, but they aren't planning a float, and they aren't planning to steal the hand later. So this is a spot where if you have an opponent that's going to bet for information, like I said, they're betting to find out where they're at in the hand. And if you raise them, that tells them that you have them beat pretty much. So I want this player to be discouraged from messing around in this pot. I don't think that he's going to attack my bet light at all. So I feel very comfortable in this spot raising. And this combo is very good to do it with. There's a lot of turn cards that I can pick up equity on and barrel very profitably and get my opponent to overfold tremendously. I think, for example, let's say that my opponent here had Queen 10, and the turn comes something like a 3 of diamonds, and he checks, and I fire out, pot would be about 100. I think he'd be really indifferent to calling in this spot with this type of specific player, and I think he may even fold Queen 10 more often than he actually calls. So I think it's a great spot to go ahead and raise relentlessly. If this player were to do this in a balanced way, and he was a good thinking opponent, then you'd have to be a little more careful about how often you are raising in the spot. You also have to keep in mind this player and what this player is capable of, what his range looks like. I knew that he was pretty straightforward. He called out of the big blind. He's going to have a wider range than he should, and he should have a decently wide range anyway, but players are calling way too light out of the blinds for the pre-flop sizing that I made it. So this is a nice spot to go ahead and attack, and both opponents end up folding. So like I said, not the most interesting no-limit hand, but this is a spot where if you guys can start taking this line more often and really understanding what this bet means and how your opponent's range is constructed, can you rep value combos if they can think on that kind of level? I absolutely can. I can have aces, kings, ace, queens, sets. There's all kinds of stuff. Now, my opponent can have, I think, middle set and bottom set, and he could have some top pair combos, but I have all of those plus a little bit more, and my range should be a lot stronger in this spot. His limp calling range is going to be wide and weak, so I will have the range advantage. He should not be betting that often, and if he does, I'm going to put him in this kind of spot. If you guys can start thinking about putting players in this kind of spot more often, it's going to be good for your overall image and game versus everybody at the table. It's really going to set up a dynamic where players are going to not want to play with you. They're going to view you as very tough and aggressive, and you're going to pretty much be able to have your way with not only this opponent, but maybe a couple other opponents because of this kind of line in action. So keep that in mind. And yeah, so let's move on to the PLO hand real quick for you PLO guys. This was a 2-2 game. The only reason I have 5 in there is there was a straddle at some point. I don't remember if it was a button or a gun straddle, but, well, it wasn't a button because the button gets involved in this hand. So I guess it was a gun straddle, but that player did not get involved in this hand, so it doesn't matter. I make it 10 in a 5-handed game, or maybe it was 6-handed with this player, but like I said, guys, it doesn't matter. This hand is accurate. So I make it 10 with 9, 7, 6, 5 with single suit, a decent rundown 5-handed. I think these players are not very competent. There was one pretty solid opponent at the table, and the other guys, though, I think were either just okay or maybe a little bit below average. So I think I can get away with playing this kind of hand and not having to worry about being quite in position, but I do think this is probably just barely strong enough 5-handed. The player directly to my left in the cutoff calls, and the player on the button who is very aggro and I think very novice at PLO. Not a lot of PLO experience at all. I've played a lot of no limit with this player. He is very aggressive, but in a spewy way, I think. I think if he could tone that down a little bit, he would be a player that could be quite good and could put players in a lot of tough spots. My 2 other opponents decide to fold, and this is a spot where you have to understand what kind of visibility you have with your hand. I think this is a very ace-ace heavy range. I gave him, I believe, ace-king-king as well, just because I think he's capable of that. I think he could have, like, some ace-high rundowns. The point is, I think this hand is not really dominated when I flop anything. I think I have good visibility. Something else to keep in mind, though, is if I go multi-way, this is not a hand that I really want to be getting involved multi-way. However, this is a case of really knowing my opponent. This player is very straightforward. I don't think he likes to get involved for a lot of money pre-flop, so I think he's going to overfold this spot a lot, and I felt comfortable with calling the bet, knowing that he's probably going to fold more often than he should. And the thing is, he's probably calling my initial raise way too wide anyway, so I think I can factor that in, just think that he is going to be a little too wide and calling a little too often, so he does go ahead and fold, lucky for me. And we see a flop of Jack 4-3 with an SPR of about 3.5. And I think a lot of you guys pre-flop aren't really sure what to do in that spot when you know your opponent has an ace-ace heavy range. You're going to have at least about 40% equity, especially if you're considering just heads up how your ranges are constructed. If you have these middling rundowns, you often have at least about 40% equity, maybe even closer to 45. So you're getting close to a coin flip, and that's where I think a lot of novice PLO players don't understand is you just have a lot more equity against even just an ace-ace heavy range. And that's the nice thing I said about the visibility of this hand is that on this flop, I know that I can get it in comfortably against his range. And with his specific hand, he's going to be right to get it in facing any kind of action more often than not. But in terms of how I continue post-flop here, I think it really pays to know your opponent, like I said, obviously in any aspect or situation of poker, but I know that he's going to pot it here with ace-ace no matter what. He's not going to bet small or like half pot, which most novice players don't understand that you don't have to bet pot. And on this really dry flop texture with so much money in here already, I think he does really well with half pot or less. I don't think he needs to go much higher than that for protection and for thin value. If he just pots it, he's only getting action from a hand that's doing very well against his range, such as mine with the wrap here. So I think that if I didn't know him, and or let's say like it was a thinking opponent and I wanted to try to fold him off of some kind of hand where he has equity, then maybe I could just lead here. I could also just lead thinking that if I'm going to get it in, then maybe I should just bet, call it off, and that would be better than check raising or check calling if that was going to be an option. But I do think this was an interesting spot to talk about. I know he's going to pot it, though, like I said, pretty much every time. So I check. He definitely pots it. And I go ahead and just get it in with the check raise. And he snap calls and shows me ace, ace, king 3. So he did have an ace, ace combo. He blocked bottom set, which isn't super relevant here. I shouldn't have that many sets in my range. But with my wrap, I'm actually a slight favorite here. So obviously it's more than enough to get it in. And we ran it twice. And fortunately for me, I actually rivered a straight on both runouts. So pretty good PLO hand, I guess, to talk about general concepts such as pre-flop, knowing when you can peel and stack off. And I've talked about that in, I think, actually a few of the most recent PLO videos. But when you know that your opponent is very ace-ace heavy and you have these middling rundowns and the SPR is going to be pretty much 4 or less, there's a lot of times, pretty much more often than not, where you can peel pre-flop and then stack off on flops that you hit really anything on to give you any kind of good equity. Like if you're going to hit anything with this kind of rundown, then you're often going to have at least a pair plus like gutter. And that's going to be enough most times to get it in versus that kind of range. So I hope you guys took something away from both of these hands, whether you are a no limit player, a PLO player. Hopefully you play a little bit of both, as I suggest that you should do that. But if you have any questions or comments about either hand, let me know. Until next time, this is Nick from Arch City Poker. Take care.